Hello and welcome back to Monday Morning Motorsports. I'm Kellie's dad.
I'm Kellie.
And welcome to the show. We're covering the Japan Formula One race, IndyCar at Barber, and NASCAR at Martinsville. So I would say that none of them were exactly a banger, but none of them were terrible either. So let's get to it. Let's get to Japan, where Kimi has won his second race in a row for Formula One. A bit of an upset there because I really felt like that George Russell was the guy that everybody thought was going to dominate the race, and that everybody picked him at the top. And one of the thoughts I had coming out of that was Mercedes is not as strong as everybody thinks, particularly in traffic. Once Kimi got out in front, he took off and slowly pulled away from Oscar Piastri. But really, George Russell couldn't do anything for the longest time with Norris and Leclerc, and really showed that either McLaren and Ferrari are improving greatly, or the Mercedes wasn't as good as we thought once they're in dirty air.
Well, I think we've seen that before because, like in Australia, when Ferrari and Russell were going back and forth, every time Ferrari got in front of him, it took Russell a little bit to get past them again. But then once he finally did and was out front, Mercedes was off and away. So I do think we've seen this in past races.
Yeah. And he didn't get the benefit of Ferrari not pitting under the safety car this time, whereas in Australia, they stayed out when everybody else took advantage of two safety cars, and Ferrari took advantage of neither one of them. And of course, that cost them a better finish than what they had in the cards.
My other thought on Antonelli while we're on Mercedes, I was just impressed as a whole that there wasn't a post-win slump from him. And maybe having a week off between China and Japan helped to give him a little more time to reset and go again. But I expected him maybe not to have a terrible race, but to not be as on top of it as I felt like he was throughout the whole weekend.
Yeah, he showed very, very well. And, other than his initial start, he ended up spinning the tires and allowed 5 cars to get by him. Other than that, it was a pretty flawless weekend for Kimi and a great result for them. I think one of the other notes I have down here is a great comeback for McLaren,
Yeah.
who didn't start either car in China, and it was the first start for Oscar all season, and he brings in a second place podium finish. So good turnaround from them. They've put a stake in the ground. I feel that they're still going to be here for the rest of the season, and you just can't count them out quite yet.
Yeah, I agree.
And then, while on the note of starting races, all 22 cars started this particular race, which was the first for the season. Teams are starting to figure out the new regulations and get going. And more importantly, an Aston Martin finished the race, which Fernando Alonso, first race that they were able to get a car across the finish line in a qualified finish. Apparently at Australia, Lance Stroll was so many laps down that they didn't qualify his finish. So, and then the other big thing, of course, was the Ollie Bearman, Franco Colapinto near disaster. It was a disaster for Bearman, but it could have been much, much worse. And it was the issue that Max Verstappen has been raising for the last 2 seasons leading up to this regulation change, that you're going to have some significant speed deltas in certain parts of the track, and that's extraordinarily dangerous. And we saw that there with Colapinto drifting across the track and Bearman coming on him so fast that didn't really have a good lane to choose to get around him safely without going across the grass and then ultimately into the barrier.
It'll be interesting now that we have, a month off for the next race to see if any new regulation changes come out in that time to try to help fix that problem. In some ways, I'm a little surprised that there hasn't been an issue sooner than this, because even in the first 2 races, there were times when there were such big speed deltas that it felt like something like this could have happened. So this sort of feels like it was inevitable that it was going to happen at some point.
Yeah. And quite scary. And Ollie has a month to recover from his knee contusion. And so, of course, he's done the video after the race. He's just fine, yada, yada. He's also young. So, you bounce back, whereas at my age, you just break when things like that happen. So, yeah, that was good. And then finally, I just want to give a shout out to Pierre Gasly, and what a great race he ran for the Alpine. Held off Max Verstappen the whole race. It almost was like a permanent box on the scoring pylon of Max trying to overtake Gasly, and Pierre was able to hold him off all the way to the end. So good race for Alpine and Gasly. Red Bull
Good
still,
season for Gasly too.
yes.
Oh,
And I was going to say, Red Bull still has some work to do to figure things out. They are nowhere near where they want to be. I'm certain that Max wasn't anticipating racing the Haas cars and the Alpines and whatnot during this season.
yeah, it'll be interesting how many upgrades they're able to get in this time off, and how well they actually work once they make it back onto the track. And I think kind of the upside is you've got a lot of time to develop now before the next race. The downside is you don't have a track to go put a car out on and see how they work
Yeah.
for a month. So I'll be curious when we come out of this mini spring summer break, kind of how the teams look against each other again.
Yeah, it'll be interesting because we know that Mercedes has a strong engine. Ferrari feels that they're a little underpowered because they chose the smaller turbo, but they chose the smaller turbo for the starts so that they could get off the line quicker. And that has worked for them. And so it'll be interesting to see how that dynamic plays out throughout the season. I think the Ferrari is better in traffic generally than the
Yeah.
Mercedes. So that also helps equalize things quite a bit there. So, okay. Well, because of things going on in the Middle East, we don't have a race until, as you said, for another month, and that will be in Miami. So we'll look forward to that. The next race on the calendar was IndyCar, and the IndyCar race at Barber. And Alex Palou did Alex Palou things once again,
That was exactly going to be my statement.
leading 79 of the 90 laps, dominant fashion. But and I think this was going to be your point. The interesting thing is that we had 7 different teams in the top 8 at the finish, which is almost unheard of in IndyCar racing. Usually there's a team that hits it and they get 3 or 4 or 3 cars at if not in the top 5, in the top 10. And here we had 7 different teams in the top 8.
Yeah, and it was interesting to see how many of the teams had one car that seemed to be really strong, and then the rest of their cars weren't great, which is part of what contributes to this many different teams in the top 8. Like looking at McLaren, who I don't think we've talked about yet much this year, I think Lundgaard really could have been racing for the win here if not for that major pit stop mistake.
Yeah.
So yet again, we're talking about IndyCar and pit stop issues. Andretti a couple weeks ago. But then their other 2 cars ended up finishing 17th and 18th. And so it just makes me wonder kind of what the setup packages were. Now, to be fair, the 6 car is normally kind of back there. We'd expect more from Award. Typically, he and Lundgaard are kind of, neck and neck. And at a track like this, I would expect that from both of them. And so for me, it was odd to see Award end up so far back and just clearly in a not very competitive car. I'm curious as to what kind of their setup differences were between the teams and why it worked so much better for Lundgaard.
Yeah, Award and Nolan Siegel were 12th and 13th in the finishing order. Nope, I'm reading that wrong. 17th and 18th. So that was not a very good showing for McLaren. Of course, Zach Brown was in Japan, so seems like McLaren can only do well when Zach's in town. So depends which
He
team.
didn't show up every week.
Yes.
Well, he could be there for the April race because F1's off.
Yeah, that's true. And
Uh,
the extreme of this was Graham Rahal finishing in a podium spot in third, and his two teammates finishing last and second to last at the very bottom of the finishing order with Mick Schumacher and Louis Foster. So
Now, to be fair, his teammates are a rookie and another driver in his second year in the series. So there is a little experience disparity here at that team. But I do agree that seems, again, like a big difference in setups or something that they were doing for Rahal to have a very different race than
yeah,
the other two. I did think it was great to see Rahal running up there, though. I mean, that was fun to watch him try to hold off Lundgaard and then holding off Malukas at the end. So that did make for some entertaining racing, I thought.
yes, yes. And then the only other thing I had to note were the two scary shunts, one during practice and one during qualifying. Practice one was Scott McLaughlin literally going through the barrier, and then Will Power, no rear brakes, going into the hairpin and just straight through the gravel pit and into the wall. So those are pretty high speed wrecks that they walked away from, which is great, but nonetheless, to see two of those in one weekend is pretty scary and pretty rare unless we're at Indy.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it tells you that they've made some good safety advances in the years because they were both back ready, sore, but back ready to go race day. So
Yeah. So that has our points race right now with Kyle Kirkwood at the top and Alex Palou just 2 points behind. And then there's a pretty decent gap until you get to Lundgaard and Malukas third and fourth. The interesting thing is, in spite of Alex being in second, he has by far led the most laps this year with 154 laps led, with the next closest being Malukas with 73, which I didn't have that on my bingo card. So
Penske at Phoenix.
true.
If I remember correctly, I think that's where most of those laps came from.
Yeah.
I think it was another impressive showing from Kirkwood to finish fifth again, the top Andretti car. He's just, I feel like, really consistent right now. Has good results, not necessarily flashy all the time, but showing up every week, getting the job done.
Yeah. It shows you seems to be having good communication with his crew chief and getting the car where he likes it. Again, the rest of the team isn't necessarily doing great week in, week out. So,
Right.
yeah.
Finishing ninth and 12th for
Yeah.
this week.
All right. Well, let's switch over to the NASCAR race at one of the old grand tracks in NASCAR, Martinsville in Martinsville, Virginia. And it was the usual suspects up front most of the day with Denny Hamlin. He led 292 of the 400 laps on Sunday. Just didn't quite keep up with the track with the adjustments they made, and pretty gutsy call for Alan Gustafson to bring Chase Elliott in early, which also gave them a second chance, one more chance to adjust the car more so than the other teams that stayed out. And I think that catching up and keeping up with the track was the difference at the end with Chase Elliott, who's always been good at Martinsville, and Hendricks is always good at Martinsville. Denny Hamlin was outstanding. You have Joey Logano up there once again. Ryan Blaney ran well all day. I think the kind of the surprise, but not so much of a surprise the way he's been running all year, was Ty Gibbs. And Ty Gibbs had a really good showing with a fourth place finish. He's been getting consistent finishes this year, as seems to finally made that jump up to the cup level, where before I think he was still struggling to figure out the new car and the changes from where he dominated in the truck series before and in the old Xfinity series. So what were your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think this was a better weekend from Hendrick. We talked before that as a whole, they seem to have not quite figured out the new body Chevrolet. I'm still not convinced that they've got it figured out because we know that as a team, they always run well at Martinsville.
Yes.
And so I want to see more than just one good weekend from them to tell me that they've really gotten the development kind of worked out. I'm just not convinced that they're there yet until I see more.
Well, I was going to say also Martinsville's not exactly an aero track as much as a mechanical grip track. So the real test is when they get back to the 1.5 mile tracks again and see how the car behaves at the most common type of track that we have in NASCAR.
Yeah, which is going to be a little bit because they're off and then they go to Bristol. So another small track. My other thought was after RFK had 2 good weekends in a row that we had talked about, this felt more like the RFK of the last few years. Highest finisher was Ryan Preece in 12th. We have a 12th, a 13th, and a 19th. And we talked before that they seem to be in that 10th to 20th window a lot of the time, and this was like, yeah, yep, kind of back there. So some of the tracks, I think they're starting to figure out. I don't know that this was necessarily one of them.
Yeah. We need more data points, but it's been encouraging the first part of the season for RFK racing. Definitely didn't quite show up this weekend, though.
I also wanted to throw a shout out for Josh Berry coming in 10th, the last of the top 10 on this race. And I feel like he hasn't had a particularly outstanding season so far. A year ago he had won the spring Vegas race, and so there was a win already in the column for him. It's been a little lackluster, I feel like, this year.
Yes.
Not that he's running at a big team or anything, but this felt like a good weekend for them.
Well, and the Wood brothers do have that alliance with Penske, so there's a lot of information sharing that goes back and forth. And last year, yeah, you're right. Josh Berry seemed a lot stronger than he has shown this year. We've also had a lot of good cars taken out of races earlier in the season, so unless you're paying particularly close attention to somebody, I can't remember if they just weren't running well or if they got caught up in those other messes earlier in the year.
Looking at you, Cindric.
Yeah, as an example.
Who also had a top 10 finish. So back to when he can finish a race, he's been doing okay.
Yes, he has. Speaking of finishing races, we did have the Bubba Wallace Carson Hocevar incident where, pretty much Bubba Wallace took out Hocevar and in the end actually took himself out and had his car destroyed. It's short track racing, I know, but most everybody agrees that Hocevar didn't do anything wrong. Yes, he took him 3 wide on a restart. It's Martinsville. It's going to happen. And
did you see his interview after where he said that he misjudged?
yes. Well,
how much of that do you believe?
Well, considering the fact that others from his team have said that they've had a very strong talk and that we're in a long season points race and these are the kinds of mistakes that we cannot be making. And basically they called him on the carpet for it. So it cost him big.
Believe him.
Well, I think if you were to ask him today, he'd own up to the fact that he lost his temper and took him out. He dropped 8 points in the standings and has fallen out of the top 10. He's now in 11th.
Wow.
That's how big one bad race can really hurt you in the point standings these days. So
that's a big change.
Yes. And right now you have Hocevar and Daniel Suarez in 15th and 16th in the point standing, and their teammate Michael McDowell on the outside looking in, just 15 points back. So, I'm not 15 points back. Do the math, Scott. That is 9 points back. So, as we were watching Spire earlier this season, they're starting to regress back to where we thought they would be, but they're still hanging in there. So, a lot can happen yet.
Yeah, McDowell finished 18th, Suarez 20th, and of course, Savard was taken out, so
yes,
he still came back to finish 17th, but he was running a better race, I feel like, than that.
Yeah. And then while he didn't make a top 10, Shane Van Gisbergen had another good, solid race. Now, he's shown well at Martinsville before, but he is, in my mind, taken his racing game up a notch this year on the ovals. And so, you can almost guarantee a top 5 at every road course. And then if you can finish in that 10th to 15th, you're going to hang around in the points, and you're going to make the chase doing that.
He also qualified 5th, put himself in a good position to begin with, and that also shows that he had the outright speed, this time as well, which hasn't always been the case, I feel like, for Trackhouse this year as a whole, and then for him on ovals. So I feel like that was a relatively strong performance for him at Trackhouse right now.
Yeah, we're starting to see the usual suspects at the top of the point standings once again. So we have Tyler Reddick, Ryan Blaney, Denny Hamlin, Chase Elliott, William Byron, and the first one that is a new face is Ty Gibbs up there, and then Christopher Bell, Brad Keselowski, Kyle Larson, and Chris Buescher round out the top 10. So that top 5 is very familiar.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So we're heading into the Easter weekend, which traditionally NASCAR does not race on Easter Sunday. They did for a while. They're back to their traditional, we're taking the Sunday off. But we're having a special weekend at Rockingham coming up with the O'Reilly's Auto Parts Series and the Craftsman Truck Series. So this week's Bets versus AI video will be focused on Rockingham, and it'll be on the O'Reilly Auto Parts Series. So we don't have Formula One, we don't have IndyCar, and we don't have the Cup Series. So we're going to drop down a series to fill that void. It's a little tougher to get good value in the O'Reilly Auto Parts Series because there's 2 teams that just really dominate that series, and makes it a little harder, especially if you're trying to do a top 10 parlay. So I'll see what I can conjure up, and we'll put it up here, and we might just, skip the parlay this week and do something a little bit different. So, yeah.
All right. Looking forward to it.
Yeah. So with that, any other comments?
I think overall this weekend, my review of all 3 races would probably be watch the highlights.
Yes, I think so. I would say that the Formula One race, compared to a typical Japan Formula One race, would be worth watching the entire race. But that's relative to other Japan Grand Prix, not
Dry
Japan Grand Prix. Yes. I think there's enough there to watch more than the highlights on that one. But, if you have the time, watch it. If you don't, take Kelly's advice and watch the highlights. I certainly agree on both the IndyCar and the Cup race. While there was storytelling going on, it was not great storytelling. That the highlights will capture everything you need to see.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. With that, for Monday Morning Motorsports, we appreciate you coming by. Please like and subscribe.
It's free.
All right. Here you go. Have a great day.
Bye.